May 7, 1945, 400 hours, near the town of Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The sky was dark but not quiet. German armor moved along the tree line, their steel hulls rattling like an iron procession. Panthers, Panzer IVs, and half-tracks crawled toward the western hills, fleeing east in a desperate bid to surrender to the Americans before the Soviets caught them. Inside a dugout overlooking the clearing, Sergeant Jack Reese pressed his gloved hand against the cold receiver of a weapon no one on the battlefield recognized, not even the Germans. It looked like a machine gun. It was. It was the modified heart of America's brute genius, a .50 caliber M2 Browning fitted with a high-power scope, hand-loaded slap rounds, and zero to kill beyond imagination. Reese exhaled, adjusted the reticle, whispered, "Range 900. The wind shifted. A German Panzer IV paused in the clearing, its turret swinging cautiously toward the tree line. Reese's finger squeezed the trigger. What followed wasn't the roar of a machine gun. It was one shot. One godless crack. And then, against everything the Germans believed, a .50 caliber round lanced through the commander's view slit and vaporized the crewman inside. The tank didn't explode, it just stopped. Like its soul had been ripped out through the armor. For a moment the clearing was silent. Then panic spread through the German column like fire. They thought it was artillery, a mine, a fluke. It was. It was the beginning of a kind of killing no one had trained for. They were being hunted by a sniper with a weapon the size of an engine block, and it could kill a tank commander with one pull of the trigger. The .50 cal sniper. The story never made it into the war reports, not officially. But in the last week of the war, one platoon of American heavy weapons specialists operated behind German lines with M2 Brownings mounted on bipods, truck frames, and in one case, the roof of a destroyed tank, and they used them not as suppressive fire, but as single-shot precision rifles. Against men, against trucks, and yes, against tanks. Not all of them, not the thick hulls, but if you knew where to aim vision slits, crew hatches, turret rings, the .50 could tear a tank's mind out without ever scratching the paint. The Germans called them ghost shots, because no one ever saw where the fire came from. Only the crew died, the armor remained pristine. It started as an accident, then became a method, then a mission. Reese hadn't planned to become the most feared man in Pilsen, but by nightfall, German officers were ordering their tank crews to weld shut every vision slit and drive blind, anything to avoid the invisible kill. He had already logged 5 confirmed tank stops by the time the sun broke over the Czech hills. And not once had he left the dirt. The weapon wasn't new, the idea was. Reese was a machine gunner from the 3rd Armored Division, but while most gunners were mounting M2s on jeeps or half-tracks, Reese had done something else entirely. He bolted a high-powered unertl scope, the same kind used on Marine Corps bolt-action sniper rifles, to the heavy steel receiver of his Browning. Then he locked the tripod into reinforced concrete. And what came out wasn't a machine gun. It was the heaviest sniper rifle ever fielded in Europe. One trigger pull at a time. The gun wasn't supposed to be used that way, but Reese didn't care. His spotter, Corporal Vinnie Morales, called it the steel violin. Because when it fired, it didn't just kill. It changed the music of the war. The .50 cal round, a boat-tailed, copper-jacketed monster, wasn't meant for infantry. It was meant to rip through engine blocks and light armor, but in Reese's hands it was surgical. He wasn't spraying, he was selecting. At 400 yards he punched through an SD, KFZ, 251 half-tracks fuel tank, watched it burn before the crew even opened the rear hatch. At 700, he sent a round through the open hatch of a retreating command truck. The driver's corpse slumped out the door before the vehicle rolled into a ditch. But it was at 1,200 yards that he made the kill that would be spoken of by survivors in whispers for years. A Tiger tank trying to cross a narrow bridge south of Plzen. Reese knew he couldn't pierce the front armor, but through his scope, he saw the loader helmet off, hatch open, climbing for fresh shells. He fired once. The loader vanished. The tank stopped moving. No explosion, no fire. Just silence. Later that day, a German POW would tell his interrogator that the crew had refused to move. They said death came from nowhere, the man whispered. They saw a man die through an open hatch and would not raise their heads again. It wasn't just the .50 cal's power. It was that it struck from beyond visible range. Every German soldier had learned to fear American airstrikes, artillery, the shriek of Mustangs and thunderbolts diving out of the sky. But now they feared something else. A single shot, from no known direction, that killed with impossible precision. By May 9th, Reese's platoon had confirmed 18 vehicle kills, most of them light armor or transports, but 3 were tanks. Not destroyed, just stopped. The crew's dead, the engines still running. Morales called them open casket tanks. After one shot, you could walk right up to the vehicle. No need for bazookas, grenades, or air support. Just a man in the dirt and a steel violin. The secret wasn't the weapon. The M2 Browning had been around since 1933. It had raked beaches in North Africa, strafed aircraft over Sicily, and destroyed trucks in France. But no one had thought to put a scope on it and fire one round at a time. Until Reese. What made it possible wasn't magic. It was ammunition and patience. The .50 BMG SLAP, saboted light armor penetrator, round had been developed in secrecy. It was a tungsten core dart sheathed in a sabot, designed to defeat light armor at long ranges. With a high-power optic and a fixed position, Reese could pick out vision slits, fuel caps, open hatches, and make each shot count. And once the rumor spread, German morale cracked. They began abandoning vehicles in the middle of the road. Tank crews buried themselves in barns instead of facing the invisible sniper. Reese never bragged, never asked for medals, he just kept firing. Until the war ended 3 days later. When his co asked what he had done out there, Reese only shrugged. "I stopped them from going west," he said. It wasn't until years later that battlefield analysts realized what he had really done. 1.50 caliber round at a time. The war was supposed to be over. On paper, Germany had surrendered, but the fields of Bohemia hadn't heard the news yet. Columns of Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht units were still on the move, desperate to escape Soviet capture, hell-bent on making it to American lines where they believed they'd be treated better. Between the Red Army and Eisenhower's westward wall stood tens of thousands of ragged, retreating Germans, armed, moving in convoys and still dangerous. Sergeant Jack Reese and his heavy weapons platoon weren't told to intercept them. They simply did. It started with 1 kill, then 2. By the end of their second day in the hills near Prishtice, Reese had logged 7 engine stops, 4 crew kills, and 3 confirmed silent tanks, vehicles disabled by a single shot to the right man at the right moment. He wasn't alone anymore. 2 other gunners had joined his method. Corporal Denny Moore, a Brooklyn steelworker before the war, was now lying prone behind a Browning mounted on a sawed-off Jeep axle, calling wind like a sniper and recording each hit with a grease pencil on the hood. Private Tom Alvarez, only 19, had mounted his M2 atop the ruined steeple of a church and marked targets with threadbare field maps. They weren't supposed to be precision shooters. But in the war's final week, they became something else entirely. The line between machine gunner and sniper blurred. The secret was not just the ammunition, or the optics, or the angle. It was intention. Each man fired one shot at a time. No bursts, no suppression. Each pull of the trigger was a promise that someone or something would die before the next one. From 3 separate ridgelines, they rained invisible judgment on columns of tanks, staff cars, and ammunition trucks. It wasn't flashy. It was surgical. By noon on May 8th, the morning after Rees's first tank kill, a Luftwaffe major had been killed exiting a Kubelwagen near a stone bridge. The bullet entered his chest cleanly, a perfect circle through his uniform, and tore through the driver behind him. The car coasted into a ditch. That shot had been taken from over 1,000 meters away, through 2 narrow stone fences across a wheat field. No one in the convoy heard the shot, just the glass shatter, just the sudden slump of the major's body. His men hit the ground, searched the tree lines, fired blindly into the woods. They never found the shooter. Rees had already relocated by the time they arrived. He always did. Rees never used the same firing position twice. Morales had a rule: 3 shots then move, no matter what. They lived by it. It wasn't about fear, it was math. The Germans were scared now, not just of tanks or air strikes or artillery, but of single American gunners somewhere in the trees, lining up their next impossible shot. There were no radio reports about it, no memos, no war correspondents writing dramatic prose from a foxhole. But across the rolling farmland of western Bohemia, entire German convoys began to abandon vehicles when a single .50 cal shot rang out. They thought it was artillery. Then they realized no crater followed. Just corpses. Not all kills were clean. Rees remembered the 4th tank. A Panzer IV, painted with makeshift white surrender flags, rolling with engines hot, trying to reach the American surrender line outside Damascus. The driver had his hatch open, sun on his helmet. Rees waited. "Are we really doing this?" Morales whispered. "They got surrender flags up." Rees didn't blink. "The Soviets are behind them. If they cross, they'll be out of our reach. They've still got a turret, still got shells." He lined up the scope. He didn't aim for the body. He aimed for the hinge of the hatch, where the metal curled back just enough to leave a sliver exposed. The round hit like a sledgehammer. The hatch whipped shut, the driver vanished from view. The tank kept rolling for another 10 yards, then stopped. No one emerged. When the platoon finally reached the vehicle 2 hours later, they found the crew dead from shrapnel inside the hull. The round had entered through the hinge, ricocheted through the cabin, and torn through 2 men before lodging in the engine wall. No tank shell, no rocket, just a single shot from a gun that wasn't meant to do that. Rees wrote a single word in his field notebook: ghosted. By the 3rd day, other American units started hearing rumors. That someone or something was knocking out German armor without anti-tank guns. At first, they thought it was a joke. Snipers with 50s, an infantry sergeant said with a scoff, "What's next? We throw knives at airplanes." Then came the convoy kill. 6 trucks loaded with fuel, ammo, and personnel, caught on a narrow road east of Blovis. A single round punctured the first truck's engine block at 800 yards. The second truck tried to reverse, only to have its driver killed through the windshield by a follow-up shot. Panic took over. The remaining trucks turned sideways in the road, blocking each other in. 5 minutes later, the entire column was abandoned. Not a single machine gun burst, not a single grenade. Just 3 rounds. One of the truck drivers, captured later, said only one thing during interrogation. "He shoots once," he whispered, "and people die." The idea of it, the sheer psychological terror, spread faster than any bullet. Rees never smiled at the stories. He didn't have time for stories. He cleaned his Browning each night like a surgeon wiping down his scalpel, stripped the bolt, brushed the barrel, greased the tripod. Then lay down to sleep beside it, eyes half open, as if waiting for the next target to enter the crosshairs of his dreams. It wasn't obsession, it was efficiency. The war had taught Reese something that couldn't be written in a field manual. One shot in the right hands was worth more than an entire artillery barrage. The Germans didn't adapt quickly. They didn't have time. But by May 10th, they began altering their tactics. No more open hatches. No more commanders standing upright in tanks. Slit visors closed. Field glasses used from behind cover. Every kilometer they drove brought them closer to the American line, but also deeper into Reese's range. It wasn't about stopping tanks. It was about stopping movement. And every time Reese fired, he took another piece of that mobility away. Even the Soviets started noticing. One Red Army reconnaissance team, watching from a nearby hill as Reese's platoon engaged a convoy, reported seeing an American sniper capable of disabling vehicles without explosives. When pressed for details, they simply wrote, "The enemy stops. The metal does not explode, but it is dead." By then, Reese wasn't the only one with a scoped Browning. 3 other units had adopted the technique. Not all were as precise. Some missed, some died. But the idea had already evolved from improvisation into doctrine. The U.S. Army never formally wrote it down. But in the hills of Bohemia, the .50 cal sniper was born. And his legend grew with each shot. It was somewhere near Rockakony, in the damp belly of a valley choked with fog, that Sergeant Jack Reese fired the shot that changed everything. The air was thick and still. Birds didn't sing. The distant groan of tank treads rolled up from the tree line like the sound of fate grinding its teeth. German armor, real armor, was coming through the pass. Panthers, Jagdpanzer IVs, vehicles that couldn't be stopped with a bazooka unless you were suicidal enough to let them park on top of you. Reese was positioned just above the ridgeline on a limestone outcrop, Morales beside him, reading range and wind with fingers pressed into his jaw like a priest taking confession. 1,200 meters, Morales whispered. That lead Panther's got his commander half out of the cupola, probably doesn't even know we're here. Reese didn't speak. He adjusted the elevation. The big M2 creaked on its bipod, the recoil pad wedged into a sandbag dug deep into the rock. This wasn't improvisation anymore. This was an installation. The scope's reticle hovered just above the silhouette of a man standing tall atop 45 tons of German steel. His head turned. He was laughing at something, smiling, helmet tilted back. Reese exhaled. The trigger broke clean. The shot reached the Panther's turret 3 seconds later. The round didn't explode. It didn't punch through armor. It did something worse. It took the man's head clean off. The commander dropped like a puppet with its strings cut, vanishing into the open hatch. 2 seconds later, the loader tried to climb up. Another shot. Another man gone. Then the tank sat still. The crew didn't fire, didn't retreat, didn't even close the hatch. They were frozen. And Reese didn't wait. He moved to the next vehicle in line, a Jagdpanzer IV with a side-mounted machine gun crew peeking out through the hatch. At this range, it would have been impossible for any ordinary rifle. But Reese wasn't using a rifle. He fired. The round tore into the hatch, ricocheted once and struck something vital. The tank slewed left, hit a ditch and stopped cold. Morales grinned behind his scope. Jesus, Jack, 2 for 2. Down in the valley, confusion spread like smoke. The German column began reversing, but now they were boxed in. They'd driven themselves into a cul-de-sac without knowing it. Trucks, fuel carriers, motorcycles, all trying to turn on a one-lane dirt path while death watched from the ridge. Reese shifted focus. He stopped a command car with one round through the hood, the engine stalling before the men inside realized what hit them. One of the officers ran. Reese didn't fire. Not out of mercy, out of priority. They were still getting reports from elsewhere in the region. Other American units had adopted the same system, 50s mounted low, scope-fitted, zeroed for precise, long-distance fire. There were stories of a single private in a hayloft near Plzen taking out a staff car from 1,500 yards, the bullet entering the windshield and exiting through the rear axle. There was no doctrine for it. No field manual entry. It was improvisation turned into method, method into myth. And by May 11th, the Germans didn't just fear planes or tanks anymore. They feared the crack of a .50 cal from a hill they couldn't see. One Wehrmacht courier, captured while attempting to surrender near Nepomuk, begged the MPs not to shoot him. When asked why, he said, "I saw them, the Americans, kill a tank with one bullet." He wasn't lying, he just didn't understand what he saw. Reese understood it perfectly. The weapon wasn't just firepower, it was psychology. You didn't need to destroy the machine, you just needed to remove the man inside. That's what the .50 did. It didn't shred steel, it shredded command. If the driver died, the tank stopped. If the commander died, the unit panicked. If the gunner died, the vehicle might as well be a tomb. Reese was no longer aiming at tanks. He was aiming at decision makers. That's why he waited. That's why he passed up shots. He didn't want kills. He wanted silence. Silence meant hesitation. And hesitation in war was death. Morales had a phrase for it. A clean stop, he called it. Not an explosion, not fire, just a vehicle that forgot what it was doing. They stopped writing numbers. The kill count didn't matter anymore. Each shot had become an act of control. Even after the official surrender, Reese kept shooting. Not at soldiers, not at tanks, but at fear. A fuel truck came barreling down a mountain road on May 12th, painted white, flying a Red Cross flag, moving far too fast for surrender. The MPs raised rifles, shouted warnings. The truck didn't stop. Reese was one ridge over. Morales called it. 800 yards. That's not a medic, that's fuel, maybe worse. Reese didn't hesitate. One shot. Through the radiator. The truck coasted, slowed, rolled into a ditch. Inside they found 5 SS soldiers, all armed, all prepared to breach the American checkpoint with grenades and carbines hidden under white coats. The .50 hadn't killed anyone, but it had saved lives. The war wasn't clean, it never had been. But there were moments, single rounds fired from a weapon never meant to do this job, where the impossible became simple. A .50 caliber round, fired from a tripod in the hands of a sniper, could change the outcome of a battle without making a sound anyone could trace. That was Reese's legacy. Not a number, not a medal, but a method. The Army never published a manual. No after-action report carried his name. But in the final week of the war, when the Wehrmacht's steel crawled west toward surrender, it was stopped not by flame or shell or tank. It was stopped by a man in the dirt. And a sound that no one could forget. The war moved on, surrender lines formalized, the Red Army arrived, flags changed hands. Reese and Morales broke down their M2, packed it into crates, and handed it over to supply. But Reese kept the scope. Not as a trophy, but as proof that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a war wasn't the biggest gun. It was the first man to imagine using it differently. By the time Reese's team reached the outskirts of Plzen, the war was technically over. The Reich had collapsed. German officers were burning documents in courtyards, discarding medals, scraping off SS runes with the desperation of men trying to outrun their own shadows. White flags dotted the countryside like flowers blooming in blood-soaked soil. But Reese didn't lower his rifle. Not because he hadn't heard the surrender, but because in every ravine, in every barnyard convoy, there were still pockets of movement, irregulars, foreign SS legions, deserters with no chain of command, just muscle memory and rage. And Reese's orders hadn't changed. Observe, fire only when necessary. But when you did, fire once. Make it count. On the afternoon of May 13th, a column of vehicles rolled into view across the shallow rise of a farmland ridge, sun at their back. They weren't flying flags, weren't wearing helmets. No insignias, just tunics unbuttoned, rifles slung low, sleeves rolled. They looked like farmers. But Reese saw it before Morales even spotted it. The third truck in the line was a troop carrier, an old Opel Blitz with a twin-barreled MG-42 mounted to the bed. The belt was already fed. The assistant gunner had gloves on. The ammo man was leaning too comfortably. Not surrender. Ambush. Morales whispered, looks like 30 men, maybe 40. Reese didn't reply. He shifted the M2's barrel 1 centimeter left. The round tore through the windshield of the third truck and removed the driver's shoulder. The vehicle veered sideways, jackknifed, and slammed into a ditch, pinning the MG-42 gunners beneath the rear axle. The convoy stopped. For 10 seconds, no one moved. Then everything exploded at once. Gunfire from the lead truck, screams from the rear. 2 men ran into the wheat. Reese fired again and again. Not rapidly, just once, then a breath. Another, then stillness. Each shot chose someone with purpose, a leader, a man raising a weapon, the driver of an engine that might try to break away. The rest broke. By the time the MPs arrived, only 7 Germans remained. They had dropped their rifles and lay flat in the road with hands above their heads, not because they'd seen the shooter. Because they hadn't. One of them muttered, "It shoots before we can see it." When asked what it was, the man simply pointed at the horizon. That night, Morales sat beside the campfire, twisting a strip of boot leather between his fingers. His eyes were darker than usual. "We keep doing this, we're not gonna have a war left," he said. "We're wiping out entire decisions before they happen." Reese didn't answer. He was cleaning the M2 again as he did every evening. Scope first, bolt second, barrel last. "You ever feel it?" Morales asked, voice softer now. "Like the rifle wants you to pull it again?" Reese didn't blink. "No," he said. "It's not the rifle, it's the silence after." The silence after the last shot. That was what he remembered. Not the recoil, not the scream, just the stillness. And every time it got longer. There was no doctrine for that. No way to brief a man on what it meant to kill intention, to stop a choice from becoming action. But that's what they did. And every night when Reese lay down to sleep, that silence rolled over him like a tide. The Garans and Springfield spoke in volleys. The .50 spoke in verdicts. 3 days later, the platoon received new orders. Stand down. Their weapons were to be turned over. Surrender patrols were being replaced by processing units. Military police would handle incoming German formations. Reese's response was simple. He packed up the M2 in silence. The tripod came last. He didn't ask what would happen to the rifle. He didn't care. Because he'd already done the thing no one could undo. He'd changed the way war could be fought. A single man, a single gun firing once. And everything else stopped moving. They were loaded onto trucks heading west, back toward supply depots, rest stations, and eventually a slow ride home through France. Morales slept most of the way. Reese didn't. He kept the scope in his duffel bag, not because it was a souvenir, but because it still had stories left in it. In the weeks that followed, as Europe reeled from the sudden stillness of post-war shock, men like Rees were forgotten, not purposefully, just naturally. They had no titles, no medals for single-shot anti-armor suppression, no brass band waiting at the docks to ask how they stopped a tank with a sniper's heartbeat. That was fine, because Rees didn't fight for recognition. He fought because someone had to make sure the last men running from war didn't start a new one. His legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was written in the craters he didn't need to make. In tanks left intact, engines still warm, crews never touched again. It was carried not by bullets, but by the quiet after the final shot. The train pulled into the New Jersey depot just after midnight. The war was over, but it hadn't left. It clung to the boots, the breath, the silence between men as they disembarked with their duffels and medals and aching knees. Jack Rees stepped onto the platform with no ceremony, no band, just his own heartbeat and the weight of a scope wrapped in cloth buried deep in his bag. Morales had already gone west, Denver or Santa Fe. Rees couldn't remember. They said their goodbyes in the mess tent outside Le Havre, trading addresses they'd never write to, promising beers they'd never drink. The kind of farewell men make when neither wants to admit the silence between them might outlast everything else. Rees walked home, past storefronts darkened for the night, past neighborhoods where kids rode bikes, and no one thought about Panzer treads or tungsten cores, or the trajectory curve of a .50 BMG at 1,100 meters. His street was the same. Mailbox leaning, porch steps warped, the upstairs window still crooked in its frame, but something inside him had shifted too far to go back. He didn't know what he was supposed to do without the weight of that steel receiver in his hands, without the feel of the tripod legs braced in dirt. Without that moment, that still second before the shot broke history in half. He unpacked slowly over the next few days. His uniform went in a box, medals in a drawer, but the scope he kept. He mounted it on a shelf above his desk and left it there, untouched, like a relic from another timeline. The Army never called. There was no debrief. No after-action report requesting clarification on infantry-led anti-armor interdiction via scoped M2 systems. The war machine had moved on. So had the story. Except it hadn't. Years later, while working part-time at a hardware store, Rees met a man in line who'd served under Patton. They swapped brief phrases, Ardennes, Bastogne, Castle, the way men did when they were trying not to say too much. "You ever hear about the .50 cal guys in Bohemia?" the man asked suddenly, voice low. Rees glanced up. Said there were snipers with machine guns, took out tanks, one bullet at a time. Rees said nothing. The man laughed nervously, probably made up. "No one believes it when I tell them. Sounds like a fairy tale." Rees rang up his items, handed him the change. "Yeah," he said quietly, "probably is." That night he sat on the porch with the scope in his lap, ran his fingers over the dials, the lens, the etched range markings along the tube. He remembered each shot. Not the bodies, not even the fear. Just the moment before, the silence, the clarity, the understanding that history had paused and was waiting to be rewritten. It hadn't been about tanks or trucks or enemy officers. It had been about control, not power, not superiority, just the ability to stop movement, to draw a line, to say, "You don't get to run any further." Most people thought the war ended with Hiroshima. Some believed it ended with Hitler's bullet, or Goebbels' flames, or the Soviets in Berlin. But Rees knew better. He knew there had been other endings, quiet ones, written by men no one remembered, in valleys no one photographed, using weapons never meant to do what they did. Somewhere in the hills of Bohemia, there were tanks still resting where he'd left them. Engines cold, tracks frozen in place. Not blown apart, not burned. Just stopped. Like time itself had told them to sit down. He thought of morals sometimes, the way he used to say, "They don't hear us coming, Jack. That's the worst part. They never hear us." Reese would nod, not because he agreed, but because he understood. That's what made it work. That's what made them dangerous. It wasn't just the size of the bullet. It was the silence that followed. And the way after that shot, nothing moved again. Ever. The scope stayed mounted for 3 more years. Not on a rifle, not even in service. It sat quietly on a shelf in Reese's workshop, wedged between a battered photo album and a set of hand-loaded .3006 cartridges he kept in a mason jar. He never spoke about it. Not to the neighbors, not to the men down at the VFW, not even to the young clerk at the hardware store who once asked if he'd seen any real action. Reese had just nodded and said, "Enough." But late at night, with the lights off and only the hum of the ceiling fan above, he'd sit with that scope in his lap, cradling it like it still had something to teach him. It was just glass and metal, but it had once shown him the truth of things, the flick of a hatch before a man climbed through it, the glint of a field cap above an engine bay, the flare of intention seconds before it bloomed into action. The war had given him clarity, peace had given him ghosts. In 1948, a letter arrived, plain envelope, government issue, his name in all caps. Inside was a request, not a demand for consultation. They were testing rifles in Aberdeen, range extension, armor interdiction, suppression of light vehicles at range. His name had come up, quietly, through unofficial channels. They wanted to talk about the .50 again. He said yes. 3 weeks later, he stood at a concrete firing position at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, wind at his back, and stared downrange at a lineup of decommissioned vehicles. M8 Greyhounds, Jeeps, dummy Panzer hulls painted black. A lieutenant approached with a clipboard. "We heard stories, Czechoslovakia, a scoped M2, you were running it prone." Reese didn't answer. He just looked at the weapon on the tripod, the same M2 he remembered, now paired with a modern optic bolted to the receiver rail. "Show us," the lieutenant said. Reese stepped up, adjusted the leg braces, sank to one knee. The old instincts returned, elbow down, breathing out, pressure on the pad of the finger, not the tip. The crack echoed like a door slamming in a church. At 1,200 yards, the round struck the mock fuel cap of a half-track and split it like a tomato. The second round took out the vision slit of an old Sherman that had been reconditioned as a target. The third split a steel post in half. Reese stood up. The lieutenant blinked. "We're thinking about building something lighter, something portable, maybe semi-auto, keep the same ballistics but with optics. We could issue it like a squad weapon, a sniper's rifle just scaled." Reese nodded, then stopped thinking about it. The Barrett M82 wouldn't exist for another 30 years, but the seeds were here, in the dirt, in the glass, in the idea that had started in a Czech wheat field with a man and a tripod and a scope no one believed in. As the military moved toward doctrine, Reese stepped away. He never signed another contract, never wrote a report. His signature appeared only once, on a logistics form acknowledging return of government property. But the method lived. Not in manuals. In men. By Korea, the .50 would ride again. Not just on tanks or jeeps, but in sandbags, behind scopes, on rooftops watching intersections from a mile out. By Vietnam, it would become myth. Whole platoons would whisper of ghost snipers who could punch through engine blocks, of rifles too big to be real, firing rounds that killed men through walls. Most of the soldiers didn't know where it started. But Reese did. And he never forgot what he'd seen that last morning in Bohemia. It was near Plassey, A final convoy of surrendering Germans, their uniforms scorched from retreat, their tanks marked with white chalk crosses. Reese had raised the scope one last time. Watched them roll slowly, cautiously. One tank stopped. The hatch opened. A crewman stood, young, barely older than Alvarez had been. He looked out across the field, toward Reese, toward the ridgeline. He didn't raise his hands, didn't salute. He just nodded, as if he knew. Reese never took the shot. He lowered the scope, packed the tripod, walked away. It was the one tank he let live. Not because he had to. Because he could. And sometimes that was enough. The war had taught him how to fire. But peace had taught him when not to. And that, in the end, was what mattered.